Hi, this is Dr. Grillo, and we're going to do a lab on basic port security and a local area network setup at the access layer. So, if you've read in this class or in a prior class, Cisco has a three-layer model in which at the top you have what's called the core layer. And the core layer is basically where all the high-end switching is supposed to occur, the routing and switching, and there's not supposed to be minimal filtering, minimum firewalls at the core layer, minimum access lists. The job of the core layer is to switch packets as quickly as possible to and from the internet. And from there, beneath the core layer, you have the distribution layer, which can consist of several organizational or departmental routers for departments and organizations that are linked together and sharing routing information with one another. And then finally, what we're going to be working on is the access layer. So the access layer is your local area network. At the minimum, you have a router gateway. You have a switch, which the job of a switch is to connect devices in a common area, such as an office or a small building. And then where you have your PCs and your printers and your laptops. So we're going to kind of focus in and start this at the access layer. In addition to configuring port security, we're also going to set up a router gateway, and we're going to set up a PC and make sure that the PC can reach its router gateway with port security enabled on the switch. And then finally, we're going to test our port security, and we're going to simulate a rogue PC or a rogue laptop being brought into work, for example. It's happened before, right? Somebody brings in their home laptop that maybe has some viruses on it, and they want to connect it to the network at their work location. And so what they do is they unplug the network cable on the back of their workstation and they plug it into their laptop, right? And that would give them access to the network. Well, port security would prevent that because switches identify computers in a common area by their MAC addresses. So we can specify that only certain MAC addresses are only to be allowed to certain switch ports. And by doing that, we can prevent rogue devices from connecting to the organizational network. In addition, I'm going to show you some other things as well, how to configure basic password logins and giving a host name to a device and testing the configuration using ping, for example, looking at our address resolution protocol cache on the workstation as well. So let's just go ahead and get started. At the bottom left here, you'll see something called network devices, and I got my mouse pointed over it. If you click on it, right beneath it, you have options for routers, switches, hubs, wireless devices, security, and a wide area network emulation. But we're going to select switches, so you're going to click on it, and we're going to select the 2960 series switch, and we're going to drag it into our workspace right here. The workspace doesn't need to be big at all for this lab. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go into the command line interface on the switch, and we're going to configure port security. So we're going to click on the switch once, and we're going to go to the CLI tab over here. Okay. Now, before we do that, when you download a packet tracer by default, your screen, your command line is going to have a white background with black font. Now, I think that the black background with the white font actually looks better. At least it's easier on my eyes. And I'm going to show you how to change that and how to some other features as well. So before we get started, real quick, in Cisco Packet Tracer, if you go to the options menu real quick and you click on preferences, for the purposes of the lab, I recommend you put a check mark on always show port labels in the logical workspace, so you know that you're connected to the right port. Because if you're connected to the wrong port and you configure the right port, right? Your lab's not going to work the way it's intended to work, right? Because your PC or device is on the wrong port. So this will always let you know that you're making sure you're correcting to the right port. So I'd put a check mark on always show port labels and logical workspace. And then if we click on the font tab, okay, you see where I got the task and the instructions written down in the workspace? Well, that's 10-point font. You can increase that as you wish. You can decrease it. But the main part of it is the command line interface, right? And by default, it's a smaller font. I believe it's 10, and I changed it to 12. It'll make it larger to see, easier for you to see as we're going through the lab. And this is where your iOS background, by default, your router text is black and your iOS background is white. And what I did is I just swapped the two. There's different colors in there as well, so you could experiment with that and get the color combination that you like as far as the background and font is concerned. Okay, so I'm going to close the preferences window. We're going to go back to the switch by clicking on it, and we're going to follow the instruction. Press return to get started. Click in the background area, and then you get your prompt. And you notice you see the word switch followed by the greater than symbol. Well, switch represents the host name, and in this case, the greater than symbol represents that your mode, the mode that you're in, which is user exec mode. And so in user exec mode, you have very limited access from here. Now, very little you could do on a switch, very limited on the commands you could perform. And so you got to go to a higher mode, which is called privileged exec mode. And to do that, we start off by typing the command enable. Okay, now you could do abbreviations to commands, but if you're studying for certification, I recommend for now you do it the long way. Simply because, on the answers to the exam, for example, the shortcut to enable is EN, right? But that might not be the answer on the exam, right? The answer might be enable. Like, how do you get from user mode to privileged exec mode, right? And the word enable is going to show up as one of the answers. So we're going to hit enter. We're going to type enable. Those of you who have experience, you can use the shortcuts. Or you could just type EN and hit enter. And next from here, you notice our prompt changes, right? Instead of a greater than symbol, we have a hash, right? Which represents we're in privileged exec mode. But now we're going to go to a mode called global configuration mode. And to do that, you type the command configure space terminal and hit enter. Now there's a shortcut to that, config T, right? Config space T. But again, if you're new, I'd recommend you type out the commands the long way. And later on, you could experiment with the shortcuts and hit enter. And your prompt changes. You got the word config in parentheses followed by the hash. That lets you know you're in global configuration mode. And what global configuration mode means is any changes you make on the switch apply to the whole switch and not just to a specific port. Okay. We're going to start off and we'll do the step-by-step instructions first. Make sure, right, we get the assignment requirements nailed down. And then we'll go back and we'll do some other things, some optional activities as well. And we're going to configure port 24 for port security. Now it says log in and go to an interface. Now remember, you could do another port other than port 24. You just got to remember to connect your PC to that port that you configure. Okay, so we're going to type INT or spell out the word interface space F0/24 without any spaces and hit enter. And notice your prompt changes to config-IF followed by the hash. That lets you know you're in interface mode, and any changes you make only apply to this specific interface, port 24 on the switch. Now we're going to set up our port security, and we're going to do that by typing Switchport mode access. Now notice in the instructions I got SW, right? That's the abbreviation or shortcut for Switchport, and we hit enter. So Switchport access is a port that it switches the port from dynamic mode to access mode, in which you can do other features such as port security. You could do some things with spanning tree protocol that we may get into in a later lab. And if you didn't do this command, you wouldn't be able to enable port security. Okay. So after switch port mode access, we're going to type switchport port dash security to enable port security, and we're going to hit enter. Okay. And the next command, as you can see, I'm following the instructions. You can do some shortcuts, right? You can hit the up arrow on your keyboard, which has a command history recall, or you could type it all in again for practice and hit the space bar and type MAC address sticky. And I'll explain what that command is in a second. So MAC dash address space sticky and hit enter. Okay. If you make a mistake, right, you spell switchport wrong, right? You hit enter, right? It tells you invalid input detected. Just go ahead and type the command correctly, okay? And again, it doesn't hurt to do the command again. You could just hit the up arrow twice. But if you make a mistake, just go ahead and type the command correctly. Repeat the command the way it's supposed to be. After the okay, so what does the MAC address sticky mean? So there's two ways a switch can memorize a MAC address as far as port security is concerned. One way is to, and this is the harder way, it's the cumbersome way, wouldn't be recommended on a large network, is you could do an IP config command on a PC, look at the MAC address of that PC, copy that MAC address and type it in, right, into the command line window here on the switch. Problem with that is it's prone for error. You could accidentally type in the wrong MAC address. And so what the port security MAC address sticky means, if you know you've got a valid workstation connected to a switch port, the switch is going to learn it dynamically, and it will map it to that port as far as port security is concerned. Now, that's different from a switch's MAC address table, which if you don't have port security enabled, the switches are going to learn MAC addresses dynamically anyway. Initially, a brand new switch, right, has nothing in its MAC address table, but as computers or devices generate traffic, and it could be a simple broadcast, or it could be a request for internet access, the switch will take that incoming source MAC address and map it to that port. And as time evolves, it gradually learns of all the devices connected to it by their MAC address, and a switch can now act like a true switch and not a hub. The benefit of a switch over a hub is that what it does is a hub, when it gets an incoming signal, it sends it out to all ports, right? And you can imagine there's two disadvantages to that. One, there's a security feature, right? Because devices are getting unwanted traffic. And number two, it increases bandwidth, right? And so hence the name switch. Once it learns the MAC addresses of the ports associated with the ports, it switches traffic out onto the correct port without flooding all other switch ports. Okay. So after the MAC address sticky command, we're going to specify what type of violation, and we're going to type switchport port dash security. Again, you can use the up arrow for command history recall. In violation, after violation, I want you to hit the space bar and make the question mark, because there's three types of violations for port security we can enable. You can see the three of them. One of them's protect, one of them is restrict, the other one's shutdown. Real short, protect and restrict are virtually similar. There's a slight difference in that the restrict option actually counts the number of violations. There's a counter and actually counts the number of violations on that port, but it doesn't bring the port into shutdown mode if an unauthorized device connects to it. What it does is it blocks the port. It puts the port in a blocking state until the problem's fixed. In other words, right, the cable's unplug on back of the rogue device and connect it to the original workstation, the valid one, and that'll bring the port back up, right? So it's not as tough as the shutdown command, because what the shutdown option does, it literally shuts down the switch port. And the only way to fix it is you have to go back on the switch and turn the port back on. Even after you connect it to the original workstation, it's still not going to work, right? You got to physically go onto that port and turn it on. So after violation, we're going to hit the space bar and type shutdown. Okay. And for now, okay, we're done with the switch. We're going to minimize the switch window. And our next step is to select the router under End Devices. Just click on it. And we're going to select the fourth one over, which is the 2900 series router. And we're going to drag it up there above the switch in our workspace. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to connect the two, right? And we're going to use what's called a straight through Ethernet cable to connect the two devices. Now, a straight through Ethernet cable looks something like this. You probably have seen it before. Some of you have seen it many times. And a copper straight through cable is beneficial in a local area network environment. One, because it's very durable. That's probably the most obvious reason. Two, it's cheaper than fiber optic cable. And you wouldn't want to use fiber optic cable in an office environment where the wires could be exposed, because fiber optic cable is expensive. It breaks easy. For example, if you rolled your chair over a fiber optic cable, it's going to break by accident, right? If you accidentally rolled your chair over an exposed copper straight through cable, chances are it's not going to break. It's very durable. Okay. So we're going to select this Thunderbolt here, which represents connections. And we're going to go to the third option over, which is copper straight through. It's the solid black line. We're going to click on it. And we're going to establish a gigabit connection from the switch to the router. So on the switch, we're going to select gigabit Ethernet 01. On the router, we're going to select gigabit Ethernet 00. Okay. So gigabit, right? Gig represents 1 billion. So that's 1 billion bits per second. And it's much faster than a fast Ethernet connection, which is 100 megabits connection, right? So gigabit is 10 times faster. And one thing to remember, if you didn't have a gigabit connection on the switch, let's just say you only had fast Ethernet ports, you can connect the fast Ethernet port to a gigabit port. What you have to understand is you're only going to get fast Ethernet speed, right? Because that fast Ethernet port can't go faster, but the gigabit port can go slower. So there's an option on there. If you had that problem, there's an option on the gigabit port to actually configure it for 100 megabits per second. So the switch and the end device on the router are actually communicating with the same bandwidth. Okay, so now what we're going to do is configure the router's default gateway. Okay, now you could do the task in order, or you could do, like, I'm actually going to task 6. It doesn't matter what order you do these in. The lab is going to work. It's, the last thing obviously is to test your port security. But we're going to configure the router's default gateway. So we're going to click on the router, click on CLI. And when you get this yes or no option, you want an initial configuration dialog, select no. Because what that is, it's like a wizard, and it tries to walk you through certain steps on the things you need to do. I find it cumbersome, and it doesn't include everything you need to do. It's just simpler to start from scratch and hit no and press return to get started. And so we're going to kind of repeat the process. We're going to type enable to get the privileged exec mode. We're in the router now. And then from enable, we're going to type configure terminal. And now we're going to switch to our interface. In this case, it's the gigabit 0/0 interface without any spaces, and hit enter. Okay. Now we're going to select an IP address for that interface. And if you notice the router, right, we're going to type IP address space 192.168.3.1 space 255.255.255.0. Okay. So the 255.255.255.0 represents the network mask of the IP address. And basically what it means is that all the 1 bits turned on in the first octet, second octet, and the third octet represent the network portion of the address, right? So 255 means, the first 255 means the 192 is part of the network address. Second 255 means 168 is part of the network address. And the third part of 255 means 3 is part of the network address. So the network address is actually 192.168.3.0. The 1 represents the host address. Now, this is a Class C private address. And the thing to keep in mind using this network mask is we have an address, IP address range of 1 through 254. Okay. And if you're building a network infrastructure, and it's good to have consistent IP address assignments on certain devices. And what I mean by that is, for example, on all your router gateways, right, and connections from router 1 to router 2, for example, you want to use the first available and the second available IP address in that subnet, right? And then maybe IP addresses from 10 to 50 are reserved for hosts, right? So you want to come up with a naming convention, because as your network grows over time, it's going to be easier to know where an IP address is coming from. You want to be able to look at an IP address and say, well, that's coming from a host in building A, right? Or this is coming from a router, gateway in building A, just by looking at the IP. So it's important to have consistent IP address assignments. And from here, we're going to hit enter. Now we're going to give the interface a description. Descriptions are optional. You don't actually have to do this for the assignment, but I recommend you do it because it's good when you're looking at router config files. I mean, sometimes you're looking at a lot, and it's good to look at an interface and see a description. IP addresses may be hard on the eyes at times, so we're going to type the command description. Notice I got the abbreviation in the destruction, and we're going to call it the default gateway. You can have spaces between your description for building A, and we're going to hit enter. Okay. Last thing we need to do is turn the port on. When you take a brand new switch out of the box and you turn it on for the first time, all the ports go on by default. But with a router, it's the exact opposite. When you take a brand new router out of the box and you turn it on for the first time, all the ports are off by default. So you have to remember to turn your port on when you're configuring it for the first time. And you type the command, no shutdown. That turns on the port. And notice that the interface has been changed to up. That's what you want to see. Okay. So we're going to minimize the router window. Okay, so we got the switch configured for port security, and we got the router gateway configured. What is the gateway? It's the entryway to the internet for devices on a local area network. All devices on a LAN need a default gateway. In other words, if I need to send traffic to the internet out there in the cloud somewhere, who do I send it to? Well, you start off by sending it to your gateway. Okay. Now, notice we didn't do an IP address on a switch, right? Because the switch is a layer 2 device. Okay. Now, you can assign an IP address to a switch, but that's not to a specific port. You can assign an IP address to the whole switch, but it's mainly used only for management purposes. So if you wanted to remote access into a switch, from your home, for example, because you're working remote, because maybe you need to troubleshoot it, you would need the IP address over the internet. So the IP address on a switch is just used for management purposes. Okay, so the router's configured, the switch is configured. Next step is we're going to take an end device. So we're going to click on end devices here, and we're going to select the PC and drag it into our workspace. Next step is we're going to connect the PC with the copper straight through cable. So you select Fast Ethernet 0 on the PC, and we're going to go to Fast Ethernet 24 on the switch. Make sure you connect it to the correct port, okay? Because if you connect it to the wrong port, then there's no port security enabled on that port, right? And the lab's not going to work as intended. Okay, so we're actually on task 3. We're going to give the workstation an IP address and a net mask. And so we're going to click on PC. We're going to click the desktop tab, and we're going to go to IP configuration window. And we're going to key in 192.168.3, and we're going to give it the last IP address in that subnet range, .254. Subnet mask has to be the same. Okay, again, 255, 255, 255.0. The 255s represent the network portion of the address, right, in a Class C address. 192.168 in a Class C means that the address is private. In order to go out to the internet, you're going to need a public IP on a router. And it's similar to what you have in your home networks, right? You have a router in your closet somewhere. On the inside, it's acting as a DHCP server, handing out private IP addresses. But on the connection to your internet service provider, on that port, it has a public IP address assigned to it. So private IP addresses get converted to a public IP before they go out to the internet. And that's called network address translation. Okay. We're going to specify the address of our default gateway. And if you recall, the IP address on our router was 192.168.3.1. Okay, I'm going to just tab, and we're going to close the PC window. And notice you'll see green link lights, right? Green link lights, when you plug in these devices and you configure them in Packet Tracer, it may take 30 seconds or so for the device to go from amber to green. There's a way you could speed it up. If you see this double arrow pointing to the right, it says fast forward time. If you click on it, it will speed it up for you. Okay, next step is we're going to test connectivity between the PC and the router. Okay, so we're going to select the PC. We're going to go to the command prompt. Okay, now I said I would explain address resolution protocol to you, and it explains how it works. So again, at the beginning, I said devices on a LAN identify each other by their MAC address, right? And so for a period of time, devices keep what's called an ARP cache of devices that they commonly reach. That way, they don't have to do what's called an ARP query each and every time. Like before I want to reach my gateway, I would have to ask it for its MAC address, because if I type ARP space -A, there's no entries in my cache. So when I ping my gateway, I have to do what's called an ARP query first. You're not seeing it, right? It's transparent to you as an end user, but that's what's happening in the background. Okay, so we're going to use a utility called ping. And what it does, it tests network connectivity. It's part of the ICMP protocol. It sends 4 32-byte test packets called echo requests, and then it gets 4 32-byte echo replies back from the device you're trying to reach, right? It's like that old Verizon commercial. Can you hear me now? Good, right? Can you hear me now? Good, right? Imagine that happening 4 times. So we're going to type ping. We're going to type the IP address of the gateway, And we're going to hit enter. And notice we get 4 successful replies. Now, if you hit the up arrow twice on your keyboard and you look at your ARP cache, right? Now you've got the MAC address of the gateway associated with its IP address. So next time you ping it, it won't have to do a MAC address query. Okay, so we're good with the PC. What we want to do now is examine our port security. So we're going to go back on the switch. Okay, after a period of time, it logs you out, which is okay. We're going to press return to get started. We're going to type enable. And now we're in privileged exec mode. So we're going to type the command show port -security. If it didn't log you out and you're still in interface mode, so I'm going to simulate that you're still in interface mode. Notice I used abbreviated commands, right? If you type the command end and hit enter twice, it'll take you back to privileged exec mode. Okay, so we're going to type the command show port -security and hit enter. And we want to make sure that we have port security enabled on port 24. It's in shutdown mode. There's a more detailed show command that's actually better. We're going to type show port -security interface, or INT, F space /24 and hit enter. It's going to show us port security for that interface. So we want to see that it's enabled and that the port status is secure and it's up. The violation mode we specified is shutdown. Okay, the maximum number of MAC addresses is 1. Total number of MAC addresses is 1. And notice how it mapped the MAC address of the PC to that specific port. Okay, now the MAC address of the PC, and we'll just remember the last 4 is 3BB4. If you want to verify that, learn the MAC address of the PC dynamically with the sticky command. Click on the PC, go to the command prompt, and type ipconfig, all one word. And here's the MAC address of the PC. Notice the last 4, 3BB4, matches what's been dynamically mapped to on the switch. Okay, so the next step is to actually test our port security. Okay, so what we would do in this case is we're going to simulate bringing a rogue laptop into work. So we're going to click on end device. We're going to select the laptop. We're going to drag it into the workspace. And what we're going to do is delete the cable connection from the PC to the switch. You're going to click this under the edit menu. You're going to click the left arrow with the X mark in it that says delete. Click on it. Okay, sometimes it asks if you want to delete the entire switch. Hit cancel. Okay, the way to avoid that, I always forget, before you want to delete something, just click anywhere in the workspace and then click that delete. Notice your mouse pointer turns into an X. Just point it over the cable in the middle somewhere and click on it and it's gone, right? Hit the escape key and click the connections, the Thunderbolt. Select the third one over, copper straight through. And on the laptop, select Fast Ethernet 0 and connect it to port 24 on the switch. Okay, now we're going to give the laptop an IP address. We're going to click on it. We're going to select the desktop mode. We're going to select the IP configuration window. It hasn't tried to generate any traffic yet, so we're going to type 192.168.3, and let's type 253 for the IP. Tab over to subnet mask. Leave that at 255.255.255.0, and key in 192.168.3.1 for the gateway. Hit the tab. Close the laptop window. Now look what's happened to the red link lights, right? The link lights have gone right from green here, and they're red, right? The laptop will not be able to ping its gateway because port security has been enabled. So click on the command prompt. You can verify your IP address, ipconfig, right? That's the MAC address. That's not the MAC address. It's not 3BB4, right? That's a different MAC address. Even though it has a valid IP address, a valid mask, and a valid gateway address, notice when you try to ping your gateway, right? I'll drag this window up. It's going to be unsuccessful, right? It's going to try 4 times, and the request is going to time out 4 times. And if you don't want to wait the full time, you could just do a Control-C on your keyboard, right? Sent 3 packets, 0 received, 3 of them lost, right? Because the port's in shutdown mode. Okay. Now, if we do the port security on our switch again, click on the switch, hit enter, and if you hit the up arrow, see, it tells you the last source, right? But it also tells you, notice the MAC address matches the MAC address of the laptop, but that the security violation count has increased to 1, right? So you've got a security violation with this MAC address. So in order to fix this, first thing we got to do is delete the connection between the virus laptop with all the viruses on it, right? The bad boy laptop, we'll call it. And then we'll click on the delete key again. First, click on the white space, click the delete under edit menu. Pointer turns into an X. Click on that cable port, right? Hit the escape key. Now, the only way, remember I said at the beginning of the lab, the only way to fix this violation issue is you got to turn the port back on. We got to go back to that interface. We got to type enable on the switch. We got to go to configure terminal. I'm going to do the shortcut this time, config T. You can also type CONFI space T, right? Accomplishes the same thing. Abbreviate interface for INT space F0/24. Okay, now the first thing you have to do, it's been dynamically shut down with port security. You have to first administratively shut it down. So you type shutdown, okay? And notice the state has been changed to administratively down. And then you want to turn it back on with the no shut command or no shutdown, right? It should come up. And then from what we're going to do next is go ahead and click the copper straight through cable. We're going to connect the PC. Got to connect the fast Ethernet 0 to port 24. And we're going to fast forward our time. And notice the green link lights come up. Okay. You got to make the connection, right? And the port will come back up. But you have to manually go in there and turn that port back on, right? The port violation command, the shutdown option for violation requires that you physically go back in there and turn on the port. If we had entered either protect or restrict, all we would have to do is connect the correct PC to the right switch port, and we wouldn't have to go back into the switch. Okay, so that covers everything in the lab. Now I'm going to show you some optional activities, and I would recommend, but let me show you how to save the lab. For those of you who are familiar with configuring a router and a switch and already know how to do the passwords and host names. Okay, I'm going to minimize the switch window. And first thing we need to do is we need to go onto the switch. and we need to get back to privileged exec mode. So we're going to type end and hit enter twice to get us back to privileged exec mode. And then we're going to type the command copy space run start. Okay, I'll explain that in a second. We're going to hit enter once and hit enter twice to accept the default file name. Okay. This is like if you were to reboot the switch, you would lose everything because everything was running in memory until now. It's just like saving a file, right? Nowadays they have automatic file saving, but let's just say you're using an older PC, older version of Office, and if you got a Word document open, it's running in memory until you save it, right? So if you were to restart your computer, you would lose that file. Well, it's the same thing here. Copy run start means copy what's running in memory, right? It's called the running configuration. Same thing as memory, and save it to the startup config file. And on a switch or a router, it's called flash memory, right? It's similar, analogous to a hard drive on a PC or a laptop. So copy run start again means save what's running in memory, save it to flash, which is the startup config file. Or I'm sorry, it's not flash. It's called non-volatile random access memory. Okay, so it means copy from what's running in memory to what's running in non-volatile random access memory, or NVRAM. Okay, so what flash is used for is to save the operating system file. But the configuration file, the one that we just did, is saved in non-volatile random access memory, or NVRAM. Sorry about that. So it's saved. Okay, you can close the switch window, and we're going to do the same thing on the router. Okay, notice it logged us out. We're going to type enable, or EN, and type config T. I'll spell it out this time. Oh no, we don't go to global config mode. We're in privileged exec mode. Type the same command, copy, run, start, right? With spaces between copy and run and start. Hit enter, accept the default file name, and hit enter again. Okay, that saves it. Okay, your PCs, right, will automatically be saved. There's nothing you need to do there. And to save the file, you would go File, Save As. You want to leave the file type as Cisco Packet Tracer Activity, PKT. And what you want to do here is you would type your last name. It could be upper lowercase, followed by your first name, and followed by lab 1, right? And then you would just upload that into the assignment area. Or if it's not part of the grading, you would just let me know. I'm not sure how the course is going to be built. You may have to just mail it to me or send me a course room message with the file, and I would have to mark it complete for the lab. Because this lab can be used for many courses, and some of the labs are not part of the grade, and some of the labs are part of the grade. But anyway, as long as you got the file name and you got it saved to your computer, you're good to go. So you could save it in your desktop. You can save it on your documents, wherever you want to save it, and just click save. Okay, and that saves your file, and then you would be done with the lab. Now to do the optional activities real quick, I'm going to show you how to create what's called the line console password. So if I log out of the switch by typing exit, right? When I log back in, I don't have to type a password to get to user exec mode. So I want to at least establish a password to get to user exec mode. And to do that, I type the command enable, type the command config T, and I'm going to type the command line console space 0. Hit enter. And again, this is used to establish the user exec command password when you initially log into a switch. You're going to type the command password space followed by whatever you want the password to be. Okay, we're going to keep simple passwords for the purposes of the lab. I mean, you could type ABC if you want. Obviously, if you were in a production environment, right, in the real world, you would type more complex passwords. Okay, so I'm just going to type Cisco, hit enter, and to get a login prompt, I'm going to type login. Okay, now when I type enable to get to privileged exec mode, I'm not prompted for a password either. And so I want to create what's called an enable secret password, right? That when I go from user exec mode to privileged exec mode, I'm prompted for a password, right? Now this password's encrypted on the encryption file, so it's a little bit more protected, right? And so to do that, you type the command enable space secret space whatever you want the password to be, and I'll just type Cisco again, okay? And I'll hit enter. Okay. Now, again, you've made some changes, right, to the router config file. What you want to do is go type exit and hit enter again. And you're going to type the command copy, run, start. Save that. Okay. Otherwise, when you reboot the switch, right, your port security is still going to be in there, but that password, the passwords you created wouldn't be in there. So we're going to log out of the switch. We're going to test it by typing exit. Press return to get started, and we're prompted for a password. We're going to type Cisco. Now notice it doesn't show you the characters when you're typing, and that can throw you off. So what I tend to do is just not look at the screen, because it's just weird. You're typing characters and you're not seeing anything. So I just tend not to look at it. I know what the password is. And from here, I'm going to type enable for EN and hit enter. Notice I'm prompted for a password again. I'm going to type Cisco and hit enter. Okay. One final thing I'm going to show you how to do. It's how to create a host name. Okay. So notice the default host name is Switch. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to go to global config mode by typing config space T. And I'm going to type the command hostname space, I'll call it building A. There can't be any spaces in the host name, right? There can be spaces in a description, right? If you want to give it an interface a name on a router or a switch, but for a host name, it can't have any spaces. So we're going to type building A, hit enter. Look what that does to your prompt, right? And type exit, hit enter again. And again, you want to save the file, copy, run, start, right? Okay, so you can repeat that process on the router on your own. Okay, so exactly the commands I did on the switch are the same commands you're going to do on the router to create the line console password, right? And to create the privilege exec or enable secret password. And I just want to show you one final thing. If you want to look at the config file that you typed, type the command show space run, hit enter. Okay, now notice the enable secret password is encrypted, right? We know our password is Cisco, but here's the encrypted password on the show run command. Now, if you scroll down and using your enter key, scroll down to port 24. Notice we haven't made any changes to other ports. We configured port security on port 24. And if we scroll down, notice the line console password is not encrypted. You see Cisco in plain text. So you can see the levels of security, right, between user exec mode and privileged exec mode. Now when you're done with it, just hit the letter Q on your keyboard for quit, okay? You could do the same thing on the router. Now when you do the same thing on the router, again, remember to do your copy run start command, all right? So again, if you make updates, you've already done a file save as, you just need to go file save, right, when you make updates. And so what you learned today is, how to configure port security on a switch, how to configure a router gateway, how to assign an IP address to a PC, how address resolution protocol works, and we tested actually the port security, and we actually reset the port security violations as well. Okay. Any questions on the lab, feel free to send me a message, course room email, or ask your instructor area of the course room. Be more than willing to help. Okay. So I wish everybody a pleasant day and take care.